My name is Jennifer Walsh, and 3 months ago, my family tore itself apart fighting over my grandfather's $2 million estate. What they did not know was that 6 months earlier, Grandpa had secretly left me $28 million in a trust fund that would not be revealed till after all the legal fighting was finished. As I watched my relatives destroy decades of relationships over money they thought existed, I kept quiet about the fortune that was already mine. If you are watching this right now, drop a comment letting me know where you are viewing from. Before I tell you about the most satisfying family drama you have ever heard, hit like and subscribe to hear more real stories about greed, betrayal, and what happens when people show their true colors over inheritance money. The story begins 2 years ago when I was 28 years old, working as a nurse at Portland General Hospital, and completely unaware that my life was about to change in ways I could never have imagined. My grandfather, Thomas Walsh, was 86 years old and had been living independently in his own home, despite pressure from my aunts and uncles to move into assisted living or come live with one of them, Grandpa. Thomas was a remarkable man who had immigrated to America from Ireland when he was 19 years old with nothing but $40 in his pocket and an aunt. Unshakable determination to build a better life for his future family. He had worked construction jobs during the day and attended night school to learn accounting, eventually starting his own small business providing bookkeeping services to other Irish immigrants who were struggling to navigate American financial systems. Over the course of 45 years, Grandpa Thomas had built his modest accounting practice into a successful financial consulting firm that served hundreds of small businesses throughout Oregon and Washington. He had also invested wisely in real estate and stocks, accumulating wealth that none of us fully understood or appreciated until after his death. To us, he was just Grandpa Thomas who lived in the same modest house he had purchased in 1958 and drove a 15-year-old Honda Civic that he refused to replace despite our offers to help him buy something newer. What made Grandpa Thomas special to me was not just his success or his generosity, but his genuine interest in understanding each of his grandchildren as individuals rather than just treating us as a group. While my cousins were often too busy with their own lives to spend time with him, I made a point of visiting Grandpa Thomas every Sunday afternoon for lunch and conversation. During these weekly visits, we would talk about everything from my work at the hospital to his memories of building his business to current events and politics. Grandpa Thomas was incredibly intelligent and well-informed, reading multiple newspapers every day and staying current with financial markets and economic trends even in his 80s. He had strong opinions about everything, but was always willing to listen to different perspectives and engage in thoughtful discussions. More importantly, Grandpa Thomas seemed genuinely proud of my career as a nurse and interested in hearing about my patients and the challenges I faced at work. He would ask detailed questions about medical procedures and hospital policies, remembering details from previous conversations and following up on stories I had told him weeks earlier. This level of attention and care was something I never received from other family members, who typically showed interest in my life only when they needed something. My relationship with the rest of the Walsh family was complicated and often frustrating. My father, Michael Walsh, was Grandpa Thomas's oldest son, and had always assumed he would inherit the family business when his father retired or died. Dad worked as an insurance agent and made decent money, but he had never shown much interest in learning about Grandpa Thomas's financial consulting work or developing the skills that would allow him to take over the business successfully. My mother, Patricia Walsh, came from a wealthy family herself and had always been somewhat condescending toward Grandpa Thomas's immigrant background and working-class origins. She tolerated family gatherings but made little effort to build genuine relationships with his side of the family, preferring to spend time with her own relatives who shared her social status and cultural background. I have two siblings who both had very different relationships with Grandpa Thomas than I did. My older brother Kevin, 32, worked in software sales and was always asking Grandpa for business advice or trying to convince him to invest in various technology companies. Kevin saw Grandpa Thomas primarily as a potential source of capital for his entrepreneurial schemes rather than as a person worth knowing for his own sake. My younger sister, Michelle, 26, was a stay-at-home mother of 3 young children who rarely visited Grandpa Thomas unless she needed money for household expenses or children's activities. Michelle had married young to a man whose income barely covered their basic needs, and she had developed a pattern of asking family members for financial assistance that she rarely repaid. The extended Walsh family included my father's 2 siblings, each with their own children and financial situations that would become crucial to understanding the inheritance battle that eventually tore our family apart. My uncle, Robert Walsh, 55, was a high school principal who had always been jealous of his father's business success and resentful that he had chosen education over entrepreneurship. Uncle Robert had 3 children, all in their 20s, who had expensive college loans and were struggling to establish their careers. My Aunt Suzanne Walsh Morrison, 53, had married a successful lawyer and lived in a wealthy suburb outside Seattle. Aunt Susan had always been the most demanding of Grandpa Thomas's children, frequently asking him for money to fund her children's private school tuition, family vacations, and various luxury purchases she felt were necessary to maintain her social status. Aunt Susan had 2 children, both teenagers, who attended expensive private schools and participated in costly activities like competitive sailing and horseback riding. She had convinced herself that Grandpa Thomas owed her financial support because she had married well and was raising successful children who would reflect well on the Walsh family name. What none of us realized was that Grandpa Thomas had been carefully observing all of these family dynamics for years, taking note of who showed genuine interest in him as a person versus who only contacted him when they needed money or favors. He had been particularly disappointed by the way most of his children and grandchildren treated his wealth as something they were entitled to inherit rather than something he had earned through decades of hard work and sacrifice. 18 months ago, during one of our regular Sunday visits, Grandpa Thomas asked me a question that seemed casual at the time, but would later prove to be incredibly significant. "Jennifer, honey," he said as we finished lunch and moved to his living room for coffee, "what would you do if you suddenly had more money than you ever expected to have?" I thought about the question seriously before answering. "I guess I would want to make sure I used it responsibly," I said. "Maybe pay off my student loans, help other people who are struggling, and save the rest for the future. I would not want money to change who I am or make me treat people differently, Grandpa." Thomas nodded thoughtfully and asked several follow-up questions about my career goals, my thoughts about family responsibilities, and how I would handle relationships with people who might treat me differently if they knew I had substantial wealth. At the time, I assumed he was just making conversation, but looking back, I realized he was interviewing me about my values and character. Over the following months, Grandpa Thomas began sharing more details about his business and investment philosophy, teaching me about financial planning and wealth management in ways that seemed educational rather than practical. He would explain how he had built his fortune through careful saving, strategic investments, and avoiding the kind of lifestyle inflation that had trapped many of his clients in cycles of debt and financial stress. He also began telling me stories about his children and grandchildren that revealed his growing frustration with their attitudes toward money and family relationships. Grandpa Thomas was particularly bothered by the way some family members had begun treating him as a source of financial support, rather than someone whose company they enjoyed for its own sake. "Your Uncle Robert called me 3 times last week," Grandpa Thomas told me during one visit, asking for advice about investments and retirement planning. But when I suggested we meet for lunch to discuss his situation in detail, he said he was too busy and just wanted me to send him some written recommendations. He does not want to spend time with me. He just wants access to my knowledge and experience. Similar patterns were emerging with other family members. Aunt Susan would call, frequently asking for money, but rarely invited Grandpa Thomas to visit her family or attend her children's school events. Kevin would stop by occasionally to pitch business ideas, but showed little interest in Grandpa Thomas's stories about building his own company. Michelle would bring her children for brief visits but spent most of the time asking for financial help with household expenses. I was the only family member who seemed genuinely interested in Grandpa Thomas as a person rather than as a potential source of money or business connections. This distinction would become crucial when he began making decisions about how to distribute his wealth after his death. 14 months ago, Grandpa Thomas called me on a Wednesday evening and asked if I could meet him at his attorney's office the following Saturday morning. He said there were some legal documents he wanted to discuss with me, and that he would prefer to handle this privately rather than involving other family members at this stage. I met Grandpa Thomas at the offices of Morrison, Klein and Associates, a law firm that had been handling his business and personal legal needs for over 20 years. His attorney, David Morrison, was a man in his 60s who had worked closely with Grandpa Thomas on estate planning, business transactions, and investment strategies throughout their long professional relationship. Jennifer David Morrison said, as we sat in his conference room, "Your grandfather has asked me to explain some changes he has made to his estate planning that will affect you directly. He wants to make sure you understand both the opportunities and responsibilities that come with what he is planning to leave you." David opened a thick folder and began explaining the most complex and generous gift I could ever have imagined. Grandpa Thomas had established an irrevocable trust fund worth approximately $28 million that would transfer to my control upon his death. The trust included stock portfolios, real estate investments, business holdings, and cash assets that he had been accumulating for decades. The trust was structured to provide me with complete control over the assets while protecting them from taxes, creditors, and family disputes that might arise after Grandpa Thomas's death. I would receive monthly distributions from the trust's income while maintaining the ability to access the principal for major expenses, business investments, or charitable giving. More importantly, the trust included detailed instructions about how Grandpa Thomas wanted me to use the wealth he was leaving me. He had written a lengthy letter explaining his hopes that I would continue his tradition of supporting other immigrants and working-class families who were trying to build better lives for themselves and their children. The trust fund was completely separate from Grandpa Thomas's other estate planning, which meant that the will that would be read after his death would only cover his house, personal belongings, and approximately $2 million in easily accessible accounts. The much larger trust fund would remain secret until all legal proceedings related to his regular estate were completed. David Morrison explained that this structure was designed to protect the trust assets from family conflicts and legal challenges that might arise if other relatives learned about the full extent of Grandpa Thomas's wealth. By keeping the trust private until after the will was probated, we could avoid the kind of family fighting and legal disputes that often destroy relationships when large inheritances are involved. Grandpa Thomas himself explained his reasoning in terms that made perfect sense given what I knew about our family dynamics. "Jennifer," he said, "I have watched how your relatives treat money and each other, and I am concerned about what would happen if they knew about the full extent of what I am leaving you. I want you to have the freedom to use this wealth according to your own values and judgment, without pressure or interference from family members who might have different ideas about how it should be spent." He continued by explaining that he hoped the process of probating his regular estate would reveal which family members were capable of putting relationships ahead of money and which ones would prioritize financial gain over family harmony. The way people behave during the inheritance process would help me understand who deserved to be included in my future plans for sharing or investing the trust fund money. I was overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Grandpa Thomas was entrusting to me, but also deeply moved by his confidence in my character and judgment. At 28 years old, I would soon be responsible for more money than most people see in their entire lifetimes, along with the moral obligation to use it in ways that would honor his memory and values. Over the following months, Grandpa Thomas and I met regularly with David Morrison to discuss the trust fund management, investment strategies, and legal protections that would ensure the wealth could be used effectively for decades to come. These meetings were educational and overwhelming. As I learned about financial concepts and responsibilities I had never needed to understand as a working nurse. Grandpa Thomas also began sharing more details about his business philosophy and the life experiences that had shaped his approach to wealth building and family relationships. He had grown up in poverty in Ireland, watching his parents struggle to feed their children and provide basic necessities that most people took for granted. This background had given him a deep appreciation for the security that money could provide, but also a strong sense of responsibility for using wealth to help others rather than just accumulating luxury items. His immigration experience had taught him the importance of hard work, education, and building relationships with people who shared similar values and goals. Grandpa Thomas had succeeded in America not just because he was intelligent and hardworking, but because he had learned to identify trustworthy partners and avoid people who were motivated primarily by greed or self-interest. These lessons would prove crucial when he began evaluating his own family members and making decisions about how to distribute his estate. Grandpa Thomas had applied the same careful judgment to his inheritance planning that had made him successful in business, and the results would shock everyone who thought they knew what to expect from his will. 8 months ago, Grandpa Thomas's health began declining more rapidly than any of us had expected. He had been managing diabetes and high blood pressure for several years, but suddenly developed complications that required more intensive medical care and monitoring. Despite these health challenges, he remained mentally sharp and continued making business decisions and managing his investments until very close to the end of his life. During this period, I spent more time at Grandpa Thomas's house, helping him with daily activities and providing the kind of medical support that came naturally from my nursing background. Other family members visited occasionally, but most seemed uncomfortable with the realities of caring for an elderly person who was becoming increasingly frail and dependent. Kevin would stop by briefly to check on Grandpa Thomas's condition, but usually left quickly if there were medical tasks that needed attention or if Grandpa seemed confused or tired. Michelle brought her children for short visits but seemed primarily concerned about maintaining her own schedule and commitments rather than spending quality time with her. Grandfather Dad visited more frequently, but his conversations with Grandpa Thomas were often tense and focused on business matters rather than personal or emotional topics. Dad was clearly anxious about the future of Grandpa Thomas's financial consulting firm and wanted reassurance that he would be able to take over the business operations after his father's death. Aunt Susan and Uncle Robert both increased their contact with Grandpa Thomas during his final months, but their attention seemed motivated more by concern about inheritance planning than genuine care for his well-being. Both siblings began asking more direct questions about his estate, planning and expressing opinions about how his assets should be distributed among family members. The contrast between their behavior and mine was becoming more obvious as Grandpa Thomas's health declined. While they were focused on securing their financial futures, I was concerned primarily with making sure he was comfortable, had access to proper medical care, and felt supported by family members who cared about him as a person. 3 months ago, Grandpa Thomas died peacefully at home with me, holding his hand and Dad sitting nearby. His death was not unexpected, but the emotional impact was devastating for me personally. I had lost not just a grandfather, but my closest friend and the person who had most influenced my values and goals for the future. The funeral was well tended by business associates, neighbors, and family friends who remembered Grandpa Thomas as a generous and principled man who had helped many people achieve their financial goals over the decades. The service reflected his personality and values, focusing on his immigrant journey, his business success, and his commitment to helping others build better lives for themselves and their families. But even during the funeral and burial, I could sense tension building among family members who were clearly thinking about inheritance issues and what they hoped to receive from Grandpa Thomas's estate. Several relatives made comments about his financial success and speculated openly about how his assets would be distributed. which seemed inappropriate and disrespectful given the circumstances. 1 week after the funeral, David Morrison contacted all of Grandpa Thomas's children and grandchildren to schedule the official reading of his will. The meeting was set for the following Friday afternoon at his law office, and attendance was mandatory for anyone who hoped to receive bequests or have input on estate-related decisions. The anticipation and speculation during that week was intense and uncomfortable. Dad spent hours researching probate law and estate tax regulations, apparently trying to estimate how much money might be available and how it would be divided. Kevin called me several times asking what I knew about Grandpa, Thomas's investments, and whether I had any inside information. About his estate planning, Michelle confided that she was hoping for enough money to pay off her husband's business debts and maybe put a down payment on a larger house for their growing family. Aunt Susan had already begun making plans for her children's college expenses, assuming she would receive a substantial inheritance that could fund their private university educations. Uncle Robert was the most aggressive in his speculation and planning. He had convinced himself that, as the middle child, he deserved a larger portion of the estate than his siblings, and had even consulted with his own attorney about challenging the will if he felt the distribution was unfair. As I listened to these conversations and planning sessions, I felt increasingly uncomfortable with the way my relatives were treating Grandpa. Thomas's death as primarily a financial opportunity rather than a loss of someone they had claimed to love and respect. Their behavior was confirming everything Grandpa Thomas had told me about their attitudes toward money and family relationships. On Friday afternoon, 14 family members gathered in David Morrison's conference room for the reading of Grandpa Thomas's will. The atmosphere was tense and expectant, with everyone clearly hoping for substantial bequests that would solve their various financial problems and fund their future plans. David Morrison opened the meeting by explaining the probate process and the legal requirements that would govern the distribution of Grandpa Thomas's estate. He then began reading the will, starting with small bequests to various charities and longtime employees of his financial consulting business. The first family bequests were modest gifts to his great-grandchildren, Michelle's 3 young children, who each received $5,000 to be held in trust for their college educations. Michelle seemed pleased with these gifts, though I could see disappointment in her face that the amounts were smaller than she had hoped. Next came bequests to Grandpa Thomas's grandchildren. Kevin received $25,000 and a letter explaining that Grandpa Thomas hoped he would use the money to further his education rather than investing in risky business ventures. Uncle Robert's 3 children each received $15,000 with similar letters, encouraging them to focus on building stable careers rather than looking for quick financial gains. When David Morrison came to my name, he announced that I would receive $50,000 and Grandpa Thomas's personal library, including his collection of books about business, investing, and Irish history. The money was generous, but the real value was in the letter Grandpa Thomas had written to me, which David read aloud to the entire family. My dearest Jennifer. The letter began, "You have been the light of my life during these past few years, and the only family member who seemed interested in knowing me as a person rather than as a source of financial support. Your kindness, intelligence, and genuine care for others remind me of the values I learned from my own parents. And I am confident that you will use any resources you receive in ways that would make them proud." The letter continued with personal memories of our Sunday afternoon conversations and expressions of gratitude for the medical care and emotional support I had provided during his final months. It was deeply moving and brought tears to my eyes, though I could see that other family members were more interested in the financial details than the emotional content of his message to me. The largest bequests went to Grandpa Thomas's 3 children. Dad received $400,000 and the financial consulting business, including all client relationships, office equipment, and business assets. Uncle Robert received $300,000 and Grandpa Thomas's house, which was worth approximately $200,000 in the current real estate market. Aunt Susan received $500,000 in stock portfolios and investment accounts, making her the largest individual beneficiary of the estate. Her portion also included some valuable artwork and jewelry that had belonged to my grandmother, items that Aunt Susan had specifically requested during family conversations over the years. The remaining assets, approximately $700,000 in various accounts and investments, would be divided equally among several charities that Grandpa Thomas had supported during his lifetime, including organizations that helped immigrants start businesses and provided financial literacy education to working class families. The total value of the estate, as presented during the will reading, was approximately $2 million. This was certainly a substantial amount of money, but it was also somewhat disappointing to family members who had expected Grandpa Thomas to be much wealthier given his business success and frugal lifestyle over several decades. Dad seemed pleased with inheriting the business, but concerned about whether $400,000 would be sufficient to fund his retirement and provide financial security for Mom. Kevin was clearly disappointed that his bequest was much smaller than what his parents and aunt had received, and I could see him calculating whether it would be worth challenging the will legally. Michelle appeared satisfied with the children's education funds, but had obviously been hoping for additional money that could help with our family's immediate financial needs. Uncle Robert seemed content with inheriting the house, but was making comments about the estate tax implications and wondering whether there might be additional assets that had not been included in the will. Aunt Susan was the most obviously pleased with her inheritance, though she immediately began asking David Morrison technical questions about how to access the stock portfolios and when the money would be available for her use. Her focus was entirely on the financial aspects of her bequest rather than any emotional or sentimental value. After David Morrison finished reading the will and explaining the probate process, family members began asking questions and making comments that revealed their true priorities and concerns. Most of the discussion focused on money rather than memories of Grandpa Thomas or appreciation for his generosity toward the family. Kevin was the first to express dissatisfaction with the estate distribution. I do not understand why Jennifer gets $50,000 when she is just a grandchild like the rest of us, he said with obvious resentment. It seems like the money should be divided more equally among people in the same generation. Michelle agreed, pointing out that $50,000 was a substantial amount for someone my age and suggesting that perhaps some of my bequests should be redirected to help fund her children's immediate needs. She argued that as a mother of 3 young children, she had more pressing financial responsibilities than a single person with a steady job. Uncle Robert was more direct in his criticism of the estate distribution. I think my father made some poor decisions about how to divide his assets, he said. Looking directly at Dad, the business is probably worth less than he thought, and some of us are getting cash while others are getting property or business assets that might be difficult to monetize. Aunt Susan, despite receiving the largest individual bequest, was also complaining about the estate structure. I was hoping for more liquid assets, she said, rather than stock portfolios that might lose value before I can access the money. She was also questioning whether the artwork and jewelry had been properly appraised and whether their estimated values were accurate. Even Dad, who had received both money and the business he had always wanted to inherit, was expressing concerns about the overall size of the estate. I expected there to be more money available, he said to David Morrison. My father lived very frugally and worked successfully for over 40 years. Where did all of his wealth go? David Morrison explained that the estate values reflected all of the assets that were subject to probate, and that Grandpa Thomas had been generous with charitable giving during his lifetime, which had reduced the total amount available for family inheritance. He also pointed out that estate and income taxes had consumed a significant portion of what might otherwise have been available for distribution. Listen to these complaints and criticisms, I felt increasingly uncomfortable with my family's focus on money rather than gratitude for Grandpa Thomas's generosity. These people had just received nearly $2 million in combined bequests. Yet they were complaining that it was not enough and questioning whether the distribution was fair. But what bothered me most was the complete absence of appreciation for Grandpa Thomas as a person or recognition of the lifetime of work that had made these bequests possible. No one was sharing fond memories of him, expressing gratitude for his influence on their lives, or acknowledging the sacrifices he had made to build the wealth he was now sharing with his family. The meeting ended with various family members making appointments to discuss probate procedures, tax implications, and the timeline for receiving their bequests. David Morrison explained that the process would take several months to complete, during which time the estate assets would be managed by court-appointed administrators who would ensure that all legal requirements were satisfied. Over the following weeks, the family conflicts that had been simmering during the will reading began to escalate into open disputes that would ultimately destroy relationships that had taken decades to build. Kevin hired an attorney to challenge the estate distribution, arguing that the will was unfair and that Grandpa Thomas had not been mentally competent when he made his final estate planning decisions. Michelle joined Kevin's legal challenge, claiming that, as a struggling mother, she deserved a larger portion of the estate than what had been allocated to her children's education funds. She argued that Grandpa Thomas would have wanted to help with her family's immediate financial needs, rather than restricting his gifts to college savings accounts. Uncle Robert and Aunt Susan initially supported the legal challenge, hoping to force a redistribution that would give them access to larger portions of the estate. However, they soon began fighting with each other over who deserved the biggest share of any additional money that might become available through litigation. Dad tried to remain neutral in the family conflict, but he was clearly frustrated by the legal delays that were preventing him from taking control of the financial consulting business. The court-appointed administrators were requiring extensive documentation and approvals for even basic business operations, which was creating problems with existing clients and ongoing projects. The legal battle consumed months and tens of thousands of dollars in attorney fees, money that was ultimately deducted from the estate assets that family members were fighting to claim. Relationships between siblings became so strained that they stopped speaking to each other, and holiday gatherings were canceled because no one could agree on neutral locations or guest lists. During this entire period, I watched my family destroy itself over $2 million while keeping completely quiet about the $28 million trust fund that was already legally mine. The irony was almost overwhelming, but I was also fascinated by the opportunity to observe how people behaved when they thought there was money at stake. 6 months after Grandpa Thomas's death, the legal challenges to his will were finally resolved in favor of the original estate distribution. The court found no evidence that Grandpa Thomas had been mentally incompetent or that the will reflected anything other than his genuine wishes about how to distribute his assets. Kevin, Michelle, and the other family members who had supported the legal challenge were ordered to pay their own attorney fees, which consumed most of the bequests they had been fighting to increase. The family relationships had been permanently damaged, with siblings no longer speaking to each other and grandchildren taking sides in disputes that had nothing to do with their own interests. It was at this point, when all legal proceedings related to Grandpa Thomas's estate were finally completed, that David Morrison contacted me to schedule a meeting about the trust fund that had been waiting for my control throughout the entire family conflict. The timing was perfect, because I had spent months observing exactly how my relatives behaved when they thought money was involved. The next phase of my story begins with a phone call that would change not just my life, but my understanding of family, loyalty, and what money really means when it comes to relationships between people who claim to love each other. But that revelation and what I decided to do with $28 million would prove that sometimes the best revenge is letting people reveal their true character without any interference from you. David Morrison's office felt different when I returned there alone, knowing that I was about to gain control of a fortune that would make me one of the wealthiest people in Oregon. The trust fund documents were even more complex than I remembered. But the basic structure was simple. I now had complete control over $28 million and the responsibility to use it according to my own values and judgment. The trust included detailed investment portfolios, real estate holdings throughout the Pacific Northwest, shares in several successful businesses, and enough cash to fund any lifestyle I could imagine. More importantly, it included Grandpa Thomas's final letter to me, a 20-page document that explained his hopes for how the money would be used and his assessment of our family's character based on their behavior during the estate dispute. Jennifer, the letter began, "If you are reading this, it means the probate process is complete and you have had the opportunity to observe how your relatives behaved when they thought there was money at stake. I hope their actions during this period have given you valuable insights into their priorities and values, because those insights will be crucial as you decide how to use the resources I am entrusting to your care, Grandpa." Thomas went on to describe his disappointment with the way most family members had treated his death as primarily a financial opportunity rather than the loss of someone they claimed to love. He had predicted that there would be legal challenges, family conflicts, and complaints about the estate distribution, and unfortunately, his predictions had been accurate. However, he also expressed confidence that I would use the trust fund money in ways that would honor his memory and continue his tradition of helping people who were working to build better lives for themselves and their families. The letter included specific suggestions about charitable giving, investment strategies, and ways to support other immigrants and working-class families who reminded him of his own background and values. Most importantly, Grandpa Thomas explained that the trust fund was structured to grow rather than just provide income, which meant that if I managed it wisely, the $28 million could become even larger over time. He wanted me to think of myself not just as a beneficiary of his wealth, but as a steward responsible for ensuring that the money would continue helping people for decades to come. Reading his final letter was emotional and overwhelming, but it also gave me clarity about what I wanted to do with this incredible opportunity. I would honor Grandpa Thomas's wishes by using the money to help others, but I would also make sure that my family understood the consequences of their behavior during the past year. My first decision was to hire financial advisors and and investment managers who could help me understand how to manage such a large amount of money responsibly. David Morrison recommended a firm that specialized in working with high net worth families, and I spent several weeks learning about investment strategies, tax planning, and charitable giving options that would allow me to use the trust fund effectively. I also began researching organizations and causes that aligned with Grandpa Thomas's values and my own interests in healthcare, education, and immigrant services. The trust fund was large enough to make significant contributions to multiple charities while still providing me with more income than I could spend in several lifetimes. But I also wanted to address the family situation directly, both to honor Grandpa Thomas's memory and to make sure my relatives understood the consequences of their greedy behavior over the past year. They had destroyed their relationships with each other, over $2 million, while being completely unaware that they had missed out on something much more valuable. 3 months after gaining control of the trust fund, I decided it was time to reveal the truth to my family and let them understand exactly what their greed and legal challenges had cost them. I sent invitations to all the family members who had been involved in the estate dispute, asking them to meet me at a restaurant for what I described as an important family discussion. The restaurant meeting was scheduled for a Sunday afternoon in December, almost exactly 1 year after Grandpa Thomas's death. Most of the family members who had been fighting over his estate agreed to attend, apparently hoping that I had discovered additional assets or information that might reopen the inheritance dispute they had. Recently lost Dad and Mom arrived first, followed by Kevin and his wife Sarah. Michelle came with her husband Tom, and even Uncle Robert and Aunt Susan attended, despite the fact that they were barely speaking to each other after their legal battle. The only family members who declined to attend were Uncle Robert's adult children. who apparently wanted to distance themselves from the ongoing conflicts over money as we gathered around a large table in a private dining room. I could see curiosity and speculation in everyone's faces. They were clearly wondering why I had organized this meeting and whether I had discovered something about Grandpa Thomas's estate that might affect their own financial situations. I began by thanking everyone for coming and acknowledging that the past year had been difficult for our family in ways that Grandpa Thomas would not have wanted or approved. I talked about how much I missed him and how disappointed I was that his death had resulted in legal battles and damaged relationships rather than bringing us together to honor his memory. Then I pulled out a folder containing copies of the trust fund documents and David Morrison's letter explaining the $28 million inheritance that had been mine throughout the entire estate dispute. I placed the documents on the table where everyone could see them and waited for the information to sink in. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Dad's face went completely pale as he realized what the documents represented. Kevin started asking rapid questions about when the trust had been established and why he had never heard about it during the probate process. Michelle began crying, apparently understanding that she had missed out on a fortune that could have solved all of her family's financial problems. Uncle Robert demanded to see the trust documents, claiming that there must have been some legal error or fraud involved in hiding such a large inheritance from the family. Aunt Susan was scanning the papers and calculating numbers, trying to understand the full scope of what I had inherited while they were fighting over much smaller amounts. But the most important reaction came from Mom, who asked the question that went to the heart of everything that had happened over the past year. "Jennifer," she said quietly, "why did your grandfather keep this secret from the rest of us? What did we do wrong that made him not trust us with this information?" I explained Grandpa Thomas's reasoning as clearly and directly as possible. "He wanted to see how you would behave when you thought there was money involved," I said, looking around the table at family members who were still processing the magnitude of what they had learned. "He wanted to know whether you cared about him as a person or just saw him as a source of financial benefit." The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. During the months when they thought they were fighting over his entire estate, family members had hired attorneys, challenged his mental competence, complained about the size of their bequests, and stopped speaking to each other over disagreements about money. None of them had focused on honoring Grandpa Thomas's memory or appreciating his generosity. Kevin was the first to understand the full implications. What had happened? "You mean we spent all that time and money fighting over $2 million while you already had $28 million?" he asked incredulously. "And you just sat there watching us tear the family apart over money that was nothing compared to what you inherited?" I nodded calmly. "That is exactly what happened. And every legal challenge, every complaint about unfair distribution, every family argument was being observed and documented by someone who had already received more than all of you combined." The room fell, silent as everyone absorbed the full scope of their miscalculation. They had revealed their true priorities and values while being completely unaware that their behavior was being evaluated by someone who had the resources to either reward or ignore their attitudes toward family and money. Michelle was the first to recover from the shock and begin asking about what my inheritance meant for the rest of the family. "Jennifer," she said hopefully, "now that you have all this money, surely you can help with our financial problems. My children could really use help with their education costs, and Tom's business is still struggling with those debts." Uncle Robert was even more direct in his expectations. "Obviously, this changes everything about our family's financial situation," he said, apparently assuming that my wealth would somehow become available for his use. "We should discuss how to structure investments and business opportunities that could benefit everyone." Aunt Susan immediately joined the conversation with her own list of financial needs and investment ideas. "My children's private school tuition keeps increasing," she explained, "and we were hoping to buy a vacation house in Hawaii. With your resources, we could create some kind of family investment fund that would benefit all of us, even Dad, who had been relatively quiet during the estate battles." began suggesting ways that my inheritance could be used to expand his financial consulting business or fund family ventures that would provide income for everyone. It was as if my revelation about the trust fund had instantly transformed me from a family member into a potential source of funding for everyone else's dreams and financial problems. But I had been expecting exactly this reaction, and I was prepared with a response that would make Grandpa Thomas proud. "I appreciate all of your suggestions," I said calmly, "but I need to explain something important about how this trust fund works and what Grandpa Thomas expected me to do with it." I pulled out Grandpa Thomas's final letter and began reading selected portions aloud, focusing on his observations about family dynamics and his hopes for how the money would be used. His words were particularly pointed about the difference between people who earned wealth through their own efforts versus those who expected to benefit from other people's success. Grandpa Thomas had written extensively about his disappointment with family members who saw his death primarily as a financial opportunity rather than a loss of someone they claimed to love. He had predicted that there would be greed, legal challenges, and conflicts over inheritance. And he had been proven correct in every detail. More importantly, his letter explained that he had structured the trust fund specifically to reward the one family member who had shown genuine care for him as a key person rather than just interest in his money. The $28 million was not meant to be shared with people who had revealed their true priorities during the estate battle. As I read these passages from Grandpa Thomas's letter, I could see the realization dawning on my relatives' faces. They were beginning to understand that their behavior over the past year had not just been observed. It had been evaluated and found wanting by someone who had the power to either include or exclude them from real wealth. Kevin was the first to become defensive about his actions during the estate dispute. "We were just trying to make sure the inheritance was distributed fairly," he protested. "Grandpa's will seemed like it might not have reflected his real wishes." "So we thought a legal challenge was the responsible thing to do," Michelle joined in with her own justifications for the family conflicts. "I was only thinking about my children's future," she said tearfully. "I thought Grandpa would have wanted to help with their education and our financial struggles. Everything I did was motivated by concern for my family, Uncle Robert and Aunt Susan both began explaining their own motivations and arguing that their legal challenges had been reasonable responses to what seemed like an unfair estate distribution. They claimed that they had been trying to honor Grandpa Thomas's memory by ensuring that his wealth was distributed according to what they believed were his true intentions. But I had documentation of their actual behavior throughout the estate process, including recorded phone conversations, legal filings, and witness statements that revealed their true motivations. The evidence showed clearly that their primary concern had been maximizing their own financial benefits rather than honoring Grandpa Thomas or preserving family relationships. "I need all of you to understand something very important," I said, looking around the table at faces that were growing increasingly uncomfortable. "Grandpa Thomas did not just leave me this money randomly or because I was his favorite grandchild. He left it to me because I was the only family member who treated him like a person instead of a potential source of inheritance." I continued by describing the weekly visits I had made to Grandpa Thomas's house, the genuine conversations we had shared, and the medical care I had provided during his final months, while other family members were calculating their potential inheritance or planning how to spend money they had not yet received. I had been focused on making sure he was comfortable and felt loved by his family. The contrast between my relationship with Grandpa Thomas and everyone else's was undeniable and documented in detail throughout his final letter. He had observed every interaction, remembered every conversation, and evaluated every family member's priorities and values based on their actual behavior rather than their claims about loving him. "Your legal challenges cost the estate over $60,000 in attorney fees," I pointed out to Kevin and Michelle. "That money came directly from the inheritance you were fighting to increase. You spent more on lawyers than some of the bequests you received. and you damaged family relationships that took decades to build. I turned to Uncle Robert and Aunt Susan, who had been among the most aggressive participants in the estate battles. You hired forensic accountants to investigate Grandpa's financial records, looking for hidden assets you could claim. You questioned his mental competence and suggested that his estate planning reflected diminished capacity rather than his genuine wishes about how to distribute his wealth. Even Dad, who had tried to remain neutral during the legal challenges, had made comments and decisions that revealed his primary concern with inheriting the business and maximizing his own financial benefits, rather than honoring his father's memory or maintaining family unity. The most damaging evidence was the recorded conversation Kevin had initiated with a private investigator, asking about ways to challenge estate distributions and force court-ordered redistributions of inheritance money. He had been willing to spend thousands of dollars investigating whether Grandpa Thomas had hidden assets or made financial arrangements that could be legally challenged. All of this behavior had been observed and documented by Grandpa Thomas, who had suspected that his death would trigger exactly the kind of greed and family conflict that had ultimately destroyed relationships between siblings and cousins who had grown up together. The $28 million trust fund represented not just wealth, but vindication of his assessment of family character and priorities. I had been chosen as the beneficiary because I had demonstrated the values he respected, while other family members had revealed priorities he found disappointing and destructive. As the full scope of their miscalculation became clear, my relatives began shifting from defensiveness to pleading. They started apologizing for their behavior during the estate process and promising that they would act differently in the future if given another chance to demonstrate their love and respect for Grandpa Thomas's memory. Michelle was particularly emotional in her appeals for forgiveness and financial assistance. "Jennifer, I know we made mistakes, but we are still family," she said through tears. "Surely Grandpa would have wanted you to help us, especially with my children's needs. You have more money than you could ever spend, and we are struggling with basic expenses." Kevin joined in with his own promises about changing his priorities and focusing more on family relationships rather than money. "I realize now that I was wrong to challenge Grandpa's will," he said. "If you give me a chance, I will prove that I care more about our family than about inheritance money." Uncle Robert and Aunt Susan both made elaborate speeches about family unity and their commitment to honoring Grandpa Thomas's memory through charitable giving and community service. They suggested various ways we could work together to use my inheritance for family benefit while still respecting the intentions behind the trust fund. Even Dad and Mom joined in the appeals for forgiveness and inclusion in whatever plans I might have for using the trust fund money. They acknowledged that the family conflicts had been destructive and promised to support whatever decisions I made about charitable giving or family assistance. But I had been preparing for exactly these appeals throughout the months. When I was watching their legal battles and family arguments, I had consulted with financial advisors, attorneys, and charity professionals about the most effective ways to use large amounts of money for positive purposes while avoiding the problems that often come with sudden wealth. "I appreciate all of your apologies and promises," I said carefully, "but I need you to understand that this trust fund comes with responsibilities that Grandpa Thomas expected me to take seriously. The money is not meant to solve everyone's financial problems or fund family luxuries. It is supposed to be used to help people who are working to build better lives through their own efforts." I explained that I had already begun making charitable donations and supporting organizations that provided services to immigrants, working-class families, and people who were trying to overcome poverty through education and entrepreneurship. These were causes that reflected Grandpa Thomas's values and his own life experience. As someone who had built success from nothing, the trust fund was also structured to grow over time, which meant that I needed to think about long-term impact rather than immediate spending on things that would benefit only our family members. Grandpa Thomas had wanted the money to help as many people as possible over decades. not just provide short-term assistance to relatives who had revealed questionable priorities. However, I continued. There might be opportunities for family members to participate in charitable projects or community service activities that would demonstrate genuine commitment to the values Grandpa Thomas cared about. People who showed real change in their priorities and behavior might earn consideration for involvement in foundation work or volunteer. Projects. This offer created a moment of hope around the table, as family members began suggesting ways they could contribute to charitable causes or demonstrate their commitment to honoring Grandpa Thomas's memory through service rather than just financial benefit. But I was not finished explaining the consequences of their behavior. During the estate process, I need all of you to understand that trust has been damaged over the past year, I said, and rebuilding trust requires consistent actions over time, not just promises made when you discover there is money involved. The legal challenges, family arguments, and focus on money rather than relationships had revealed character traits that could not be ignored or forgotten, simply because circumstances had changed. Grandpa Thomas had structured the trust fund specifically to reward demonstrated values rather than claimed intentions, and that standard would continue to apply to any future decisions about family involvement. Over the following months, I watched carefully to see whether family members would follow through on their promises about changing priorities and focusing more on relationships than money. The results were mixed and ultimately disappointing, though not surprising given what I had observed during the estate battles. Kevin made several attempts to volunteer with charities I was supporting, but his participation was superficial and clearly motivated more by hope for financial benefit than genuine commitment to the causes. He would show up for high-profile events where his involvement might be noticed, but avoided the routine work that actually helps people in need. Michelle did begin attending family gatherings more regularly and making efforts to include Grandpa Thomas's memory in conversations and holiday celebrations. However, she continued asking subtle questions about my inheritance and making suggestions about ways the trust fund could benefit her children's education or her husband's business ventures. Uncle Robert and Aunt Susan both made donations to charities and began talking more about community service, but their efforts seemed calculated to impress me rather than driven by genuine concern for the people they claimed to want to help. Their conversations still focused heavily on money and status, with charity work treated more like networking opportunities than meaningful service. Dad showed the most genuine change in behavior, spending more time talking about Grandpa Thomas's life and values rather than just his business success. He began sharing stories about their relationship and expressing regret about not spending more time with his father during his final years. However, he also continued making suggestions about using trust fund money to expand his inherited financial consulting business. After 6 months of observing these efforts, I made a decision that reflected both Grandpa Thomas's expectations and my own assessment of family character. I would establish a small family foundation that could provide limited degree financial assistance to relatives who demonstrated genuine commitment to community service and charitable giving. The foundation would be funded with approximately $500,000 from the trust fund, enough to provide modest help with education expenses, medical bills, or other legitimate needs, but not enough to solve major financial problems or fund luxury purchases. More importantly, assistance from the family foundation would require ongoing community service and documented charitable contributions from recipients. This structure would allow family members to benefit from Grandpa Thomas's wealth while also honoring his values and expectations about using money to help others rather than just accumulating personal luxury. Those who were genuinely committed to changing their priorities would receive support, while those who were only interested in accessing my inheritance would be disappointed. The family foundation announcement created mixed reactions among my relatives. Those who had been making genuine efforts to demonstrate changed priorities were pleased to have opportunities for limited assistance with legitimate needs. However, family members who had been hoping for larger financial Benefits were clearly disappointed that most of the trust fund would continue to be used for charitable purposes rather than family. Enrichment. Kevin was among the most vocal critics of the foundation structure, arguing that family should take priority over strangers and that Grandpa Thomas would have wanted his wealth to benefit his own descendants rather than random charity cases. His response confirmed that his recent volunteer efforts had been motivated primarily by hope for financial reward, rather than genuine commitment to helping others. Michelle was more accepting of the foundation concept but continued lobbying for special consideration based on her children's needs and her financial struggles as a mother. She seemed to believe that having young children entitled her to larger portions of family wealth, regardless of her demonstrated priorities or commitment to charitable values. Uncle Robert and Aunt Susan both expressed appreciation for the foundation, but also made suggestions about expanding its scope to include funding for their children's private education, family business ventures, and real estate investments. They appeared to view the foundation as a potential source of low-cost capital for their personal financial projects. These reactions confirmed that most of my family members still viewed Grandpa Thomas's wealth primarily as a resource for their own benefit rather than a tool for helping others or honoring his memory through charitable service. Their focus remained on maximizing their access to money rather than demonstrating the values that had earned them inheritance consideration in the first place. 1 year after revealing the trust fund to my family, I had distributed approximately $2 million through various charitable organizations, while the family foundation had provided modest assistance totaling about $60,000 to relatives who had met its service and giving requirements. The contrast between these amounts reflected both the scope of community need and the limited number of family members who had demonstrated genuine commitment to charitable stage values. The trust fund itself had grown to over $30 million through careful investment management, confirming Grandpa Thomas's expectation that the money would continue expanding and helping more people over time. This growth allowed me to increase charitable giving while still maintaining the principle that would fund decades of future assistance to immigrants, working-class families, and people working to build better lives through their own efforts. My personal life had also changed dramatically as a result of inheriting such substantial wealth. I had been able to reduce my working hours at the hospital while still maintaining my nursing career, which remained important to me both personally and as a way of staying connected to the healthcare needs that the trust fund helped address. Through various medical charities, I had also purchased a modest house in a nice neighborhood, nothing extravagant but comfortable and suitable for someone who wanted to live well without attracting attention or creating obligations. To family members who might view my lifestyle as evidence of money that could be shared with them, dating had become more complicated as I learned to navigate relationships with people who might be interested in my wealth rather than my personality. But I had developed friendships with other people involved in charitable work who shared my and my values and understood the responsibilities that came with substantial financial resources. Most importantly, I had gained a deep appreciation for Grandpa Thomas's wisdom in structuring the inheritance to reward demonstrated character rather than family status or claimed need. The trust fund had given me the opportunity to make a real difference in many people's lives while also learning valuable lessons about human nature, family dynamics, and the complex relationship between money and relationships. The family conflicts over the original $2 million estate had revealed truths about my relatives' priorities that would have taken years to discover under normal circumstances. Their willingness to destroy relationships over relatively small amounts of money had shown exactly why Grandpa Thomas had chosen to keep the larger inheritance secret until their character could be properly evaluated. 2 years after Grandpa Thomas's death, family relationships had stabilized into a new pattern that reflected both the damage caused by the estate battles and the ongoing reality of the wealth disparity created by the trust fund inheritance. Some relatives had made genuine efforts to repair relationships and demonstrate changed priorities, while others had remained focused primarily on finding ways to access or benefit from my inheritance. Dad had been most successful in rebuilding our relationship, partly because he had been less aggressive during the estate disputes, and partly because he had made consistent efforts to honor Grandpa Thomas's memory through community involvement and charitable giving. We now had regular dinners and conversations that focused on family history, shared memories, and current events rather than money or inheritance issues. Kevin had gradually distanced himself from family gatherings and charitable activities when it became clear that his participation would not result in substantial financial benefits. He occasionally made contact when he had specific financial needs or business proposals, but otherwise seemed to prefer avoiding family members who reminded him of the inheritance opportunity he had lost through his own poor behavior. Michelle had found a middle ground, participating in family activities and making modest charitable contributions while still occasionally asking for financial assistance with her children's expenses or her husband's business problems. Her efforts were genuine but limited, reflecting her ongoing struggle to balance family priorities with her own financial pressures. Uncle Robert and Aunt Susan had both moved away from regular family contact, apparently finding it uncomfortable to maintain relationships with someone whose wealth made their own financial problems seem trivial by comparison. They would attend major family events, like weddings or funerals, but avoided casual gatherings where inheritance and charity work might become topics of conversation. The most significant relationship change had been with extended family members, including Grandpa Thomas's longtime friends, business associates, and community connections who had known him for decades. Many of these people reached out to me after learning about my inheritance and my commitment to continuing his charitable traditions. Through these connections, I discovered details about Grandpa Thomas's life and values that helped me understand why he had structured his estate planning in such a carefully designed way. He had apparently been disappointed by his family's attitudes toward money for many years, and had been looking for someone who shared his commitment to using wealth as a tool for helping others rather than just accumulating luxury. His decision to leave me the trust fund had not been impulsive or emotional, but the result of careful observation and evaluation over several years. He had tested family members' reactions to various financial situations, observed their behavior during his declining health, and evaluated their priorities based on their actions rather than their words. The inheritance had come with the expectation that I would learn from his example and continue his tradition of supporting people who were working to build better lives through their own efforts. This responsibility had become the most rewarding aspect of managing substantial wealth, providing opportunities to make real differences in people's lives while honoring the memory of someone who had profoundly influenced my own values. Today, 3 years after Grandpa Thomas's death, I am 31 years old and managing a trust fund worth over $32 million that continues to grow through careful investment and conservative spending. The Family Foundation has provided assistance to relatives who demonstrate ongoing commitment to charitable service, while the main trust fund supports dozens of organizations that help immigrants, working-class families, and people overcoming poverty through education and entrepreneurship. The legal battles over Grandpa Thomas's original estate seem like ancient history now, though the lessons learned from watching family members fight over money have continued to influence my decisions about relationships, trust, and the responsibilities that come with substantial wealth. Those conflicts revealed truths about human nature that have been valuable in understanding how to use money effectively while avoiding the problems that often accompany sudden financial gains. My nursing career continues to be important, both personally and professionally. Providing regular contact with people who face real hardships and need genuine assistance rather than just token charity. Working in healthcare keeps me grounded in the realities of illness, financial pressure, and family stress that the trust fund is designed to address through various medical and social service organizations. The trust fund has also created opportunities for travel, education, and experiences that would not have been possible on a nurse's salary alone. However, I have tried to maintain the modest lifestyle that Grandpa Thomas would have approved of, avoiding ostentatious displays of wealth while still enjoying the security and freedom that substantial financial resources can provide. Most importantly, the inheritance has given me a deep understanding of the difference between money as a tool for helping others versus money as a source of personal luxury or status. Grandpa Thomas's example and expectations have shaped my approach to wealth management in ways that prioritize long-term community benefit over short-term personal gratification. The family members who fought so bitterly over his original $2 million estate never understood that their behavior during that process was determining their access to something much more substantial. Their focus on maximizing their own financial benefits had cost them the opportunity to participate in meaningful charitable work funded by resources they never knew existed. But their loss has become a gain for hundreds of immigrant families, working-class students, and community organizations that have received support from the trust fund over the past 3 years. The money that might have been consumed by family luxury or invested in questionable business ventures has instead helped people build better lives through their own efforts and determination. This outcome would have made Grandpa Thomas proud. And it continues to provide meaning and purpose that go far beyond the personal security and freedom that wealth can purchase. Managing his trust fund has taught me that the most valuable inheritance is not money itself, but the wisdom to use resources in ways that create positive change for as many people as possible. Have you ever witnessed family members fight over inheritance money in ways that revealed their true priorities and values? How do you think sudden wealth changes relationships between people who thought they knew each other well? What responsibilities do you think come with inheriting substantial money from someone who worked their entire life to build that wealth? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Stories about family, money, and the complex relationships between people who are related by blood but may not share the same values can help others understand what to expect when inheritance becomes a factor in family dynamics. If this story resonated with you, please hit like and subscribe to hear more real stories about inheritance, family conflict, and what happens when money reveals the difference between people who care about relationships versus those who prioritize financial benefit above everything else. Remember to share this with someone who might benefit from understanding how greed and legal challenges can destroy family relationships while also creating opportunities for people with genuine values to make positive differences in their communities. Thank you for listening. And remember that the most important inheritance anyone can leave is the example of how to use resources wisely and generously to help others build better lives.